Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable, a conversation on readiness. Today's session is part of a regular series of explorations of the key questions of what does it mean for all young people to be ready for life's demands at every stage, and what is it going to take to get there? Karen Pittman, CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, leads lively and candid conversations with some of the most influential boundary-pushing leaders working to improve the lives of children and young people across the United States. Today's session will feature Search Institute's Kent Pekel, and is going to focus on the intersection of developmental relationships, equitable environments, and SEL. A little bit about our presenters today. Karen Pittman is president and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment and a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in 1998 with Marita Irby, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as senior vice president at the International Youth Foundation. Kent Pekel is president and CEO of Search Institute, an internationally recognized research organization that studies and works to strengthen youth outcomes in schools, families, out-of-school time programs, and communities. Kent is an educator who has worked at the school, district, state, federal, and university levels. Throughout his diverse career, he has sought to bridge the divides that too often exist between education practice, research, and policy. We have a number of slides for today's presentation. Due to the huge number of people that have registered for today's call, I think it was over 500 the last time I looked, we won't be able to accept questions orally, so we ask you to type in your questions and comments via the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and pausing at times to allow for your questions. So today's session is being recorded. All resources and materials, as well as the recording, will be made available on our website next week and will be sent to everyone on today's call. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you, Ian. 500 people is a lot. That's an amazing number, and I'm excited to get started, always excited to be able to have time to talk to Kent, who's one of my favorite people and just a provocative thinker. I put this slide up because those of you who know about the Readiness Project know that we've joined forces with the National Urban League and the American Institutes for Research to really just figure out how we can dramatically change the odds for youth. That's the Forum's phrase. If we commit to upending inequities, if we really embrace science-informed strategies and accelerate progress, and we need to accelerate progress by building forward together now. The science, and when we started this, the whole idea of the science was really, we understand how learning happens, we understand the power that young people have to really meet their full potential if we create contexts and relationships to support them. And that emphasis on context and relationships is really what we're going to talk about today. Keep going, Ian. The phrase that we've been using as we've been socializing this science, learning, and development is really this idea that the power that each and every adult carries. We're talking about every learner. We're talking about, keep clicking for me, Ian. I'm sorry, I'm not clicking myself. These go very fast. We're talking about every setting. We're talking about making sure that we're doing this in every school, every family and community organization for every learner. The thing that's come out of that science, which we're going to dig right into today, is the idea, and I like to call these the non-negotiables. We can call them guiding principles, but they're more than just guiding principles. What we know about the power of learning and development is it starts with positive developmental relationships. We have to make sure then that we are in environments where young people feel a sense of safety and belonging. And, you know, as Kent's going to talk about, we only know if they feel it if we ask them. We can't just assume that. There have to then be rich learning experiences of all kinds. We have to be very intentional about the development of not just knowledge, but skills and mindsets and habits that support the development of identity and support the development of a sense of agency. And then of course we have to have integrated support systems so that we can meet young people's needs as we're getting to know them. These really are the non-negotiables. And I think we've had a huge shift in our conversation over the last couple of years, starting with the Seed Commission, but really now and accelerated by, unfortunately accelerated by COVID, that if we don't start understanding, making room for relationships, we're not going to get to the learning goals that we have for young people. Next one. This conversation has clearly been happening in schools, but the thing we want to zoom in on, and why I'm so excited about Kent bringing us this research, is we can't just keep talking about school and out of school, or school and after school. What we really know is that when that young person walks inside of those red doors that I at least think of as school, there are all kinds of settings where you have different adults with different expectations, with different responsibilities, and different opportunities for crafting formal, non-formal, or informal learning. And we need to understand all of those. And so I'm really excited about being able to bring this forward. Education happens in lots of places. This is a slide from last week for those of you who are with us on the call, done by Hal Smith at the Urban League, just to remind us of all the places where learning and development happens. And the message that we want to really put up is that disruption, and we certainly have been in a huge time of disruption, disruption really does create an opportunity for us to think and talk differently, and we're building up those language muscles. The language that we've been talking about developmental relationships, the language about belonging, these are words that weren't in the water that heavily 5 years ago, and now they're where we're starting. Are we making sure that we're doing these? But we also have a chance to see and hear differently about who the adults are, where the peak places are that learning and development are really happening, and to differentiate those so that we can act and react differently as we're creating these environments. That clearly is going to mean coordination, and that we have to coordinate differently, but we can't get to coordination at the right level if we really don't understand what's happening in these settings. And so with that, I want to go to one more slide and then get us off the screen. The discussion that I think we can start today with this rich data that's going to come from Kent is the fact that we really need to be empowering adults and young people to understand and leverage the assets that they're bringing into their settings in order to optimize their experiences. This is co-creation of learning environments. And that means that we don't just assume that we pour in the curriculum. We actually need to understand the characteristics of the adults, the characteristics of the settings, the characteristics of the young people, and we need to be much more cognizant about the fact that these things actually mix and match together in ways that the only way to optimize is to really be much more intentional and much more transparent about what's coming in to create those experiences. And so with that, I am absolutely delighted to be able to say the study that you're about to hear a little bit about, and then we'll chat with Kent about it. And please get your questions going in the chat soon, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of them. I think is one of the most significant things that we're going to be able to use to be able to bridge the research world, which is getting incredibly sophisticated about what young people need to do to make meaning, et cetera. I was just on a call yesterday with 3 brain researchers, but bridging that powerful new research into policy and practice is going to take studies like the one that Kent is going to talk to us about. So with that, we will stop sharing my screen, or stop sharing Chris's screen, Ian's screen, and we'll go to Kent. Kent, welcome. I'm glad to see you up on the big screen.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's always an honor. It's always fun. I look forward to the opportunity to join you. You know, I've always admired everything the forum does, but in particular, this focus on changing the odds for kids as opposed to beating the odds for kids, I think should be all of our mantra these days. And so what does that mean for relationships, which is our subject today? And I think changing the odds when it comes to relationships means not leaving relationships to chance. And one of the first times Ian read my bio, and in my 50s, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. But I started as a high school teacher, and then I was an administrator in an urban school district. And one of the first times I experienced this issue of leaving relationships to chance was we were, like a lot of people in the 1990s, trying to raise graduation rates. And we started giving a survey, which we had never done before, that asked kids about, is there someone in the school you could go to with a problem, someone who you feel knows you well? And at the end of 9th grade, under half of the high school students in 7 high schools in this urban school district said someone knows me well. By 12th grade, it was high 80%. The problem was we had lost a lot of kids to dropout along that way. And in fact, the biggest point of dropout was the summer between 9th and 10th grade. And so half of the kids in this high school went into the summer after 9th grade feeling no one in my high school knows me well. and no one in my high school is connected. Now, the good news was in that district and places across the country, we've gotten more intentional, but it means that we're not leaving those connections to chance, because we know that that's not what kids need to thrive. So what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to move at turbo speed here so we have time for conversation. Let's see, it just said the window closed, and we got an error report, but I'm going to bring it back up. I know we're all getting used to technical difficulties here in this world. Let's try it again. How are we doing? We got it there?
You're back.
Okay, that's good. So this is a recent data set. It's a large data set. We collected it just before COVID hit. A few kids filling out the survey and staff filling out the survey in very early March of 2020. But this really is the world before COVID. We will be over time at Search Institute, as we always do, doing deeper dives into this data. We'll be publishing in journals. But as part of our commitment to be a real research and practice organization, we don't want to wait around until all the analysis is done and we publish in a journal that maybe many of you can't get access to. And so this is in the spirit of sharing some of those early findings, in part because we always benefit from the reactions of people like Karen and people like you to those findings. We have written this up in an insights and evidence brief that is available on our website. And it's light on analysis, as you will see, but it does include the data points that I'm going to quickly share with you now. It's a robust data set. There's 14,000 kids from grades 4 through 12. Most of the students filled out the data in schools, but also for those 80% in schools, we asked them about out of school time and other settings. So this was just where they took the survey. 13% completed it in an out of school time program, and 7% completed it in a structure that we called student support programs. These are organizations that work in schools, but they're not staffed by people from the school. City Year, communities in schools, other organizations that provide integrated student supports are great examples of that. We had an elementary sample. Obviously, it's hard for little kids to fill out surveys, but we did get a robust sample in the upper grades, and then half middle school and half high school. Pretty balanced in terms of the gender mix, and then not a representative sample of the country, but a diverse data set that as we go do deeper dives into this data, we will look at more representative samples than what I'm gonna give you a glimpse of today. So at the core of our work at Search Institute is what we call the Developmental Relationships Framework. And these are 5 critical actions that we have found young people need to experience with adults in schools, in out of school time programs, in families, in order to develop 3 really critical competencies for the future: a positive identity, agency, and a commitment or a connection to community. And so in this data set of 14,000 kids, here's what we learned about how kids experience either weak, moderate, or strong developmental relationships, which are reflective of those 5 elements. For challenging growth, which means pushing kids beyond their comfort zone, we saw that in schools and programs, remember this is out of school time, student support programs, and schools, 64% of the kids were experiencing very high levels of challenging growth. Providing support means helping kids complete tasks and achieve goals, especially ones that are important to them. That was the second highest in terms of young people experiencing that with out of school time staff and with educators. Sharing power is giving kids voice and choice, giving them an age-appropriate say in what they're doing in their school, in their program. That was the third highest, with 53% experiencing that often and intensively. Expressing care, which is young people feeling that they matter to you, was the fourth, with about half of the kids at that level. And then expanding possibilities, which is introducing young people to new people, places, and ideas, was the element of the framework that they actually experienced the least in this data set. And we've seen that in other data sets as well. One of the reasons, as Karen said, that we think it is so critical for people to be actually collecting data on developmental relationships is that we may assume that young people are experiencing the relationships as we intend them to experience them, but the data shows that that's not always the case. Here you can see in terms of strong experience of those 5 elements, what the out of school time program staff, the student support program staff, or teachers said about the relationships they build. And then you can see what the kids said. And this is a discrepancy that we've seen in data set after data set, and really trying to understand this is going to be a major focus of our work going forward. But the reason we think this is really critical is that if there's any area of life in which perspective is partly reality, it's relationships. And so One of the reasons we need this data is to understand how kids are experiencing relationships in these settings. When we actually look across this full data set, we see a relatively small, but still when you aggregate it, a significant number of kids who are saying, I'm not getting it. I'm not experiencing strong developmental relationships with teachers, with out-of-school time program staff. Another 44% experienced a moderate developmental relationship. And I think it's important to say that unscientifically, you might describe a moderate developmental relationship as just okay. And certainly if you're in the bottom end of that distribution, there's a lot of room for improvement. And then 46% of the kids are saying, I'm experiencing very strong developmental relationships with my teachers, with staff, in out-of-school time. You can see here the differences along racial or ethnic lines in terms of the experience of developmental relationships. I think very interestingly and importantly, you see for Black, Asian, and Hispanic or Latinx youth, they're actually experiencing these relationships with staff in schools and programs more often or intensively than white kids or multiracial kids. The Native American results there are ones that are very intriguing to us, as in many samples. Unfortunately, the Native kids are a smaller sample, but they were enough to be statistically significant. And so we're going to really want to dig into that and understand why those young people were the least likely to be experiencing strong developmental relationships in schools and programs. Really importantly, for all of us in thinking about what's going on both during the COVID pandemic, when many schools and programs are shut down, but especially as we look to reopening, there are important differences in how kids experience developmental relationships across sectors. You can see they were significantly less likely to experience strong developmental relationships in schools than they were in student support programs like communities in schools or out of school time settings. And as a former K-12 educator, I don't look at this data and say, let's just beat up on the schools. Schools have a lot of challenges and a lot of priorities. I think it unquestionably shows schools can improve in the relational connections they create with kids, but I think it also attests to the critical need for surrounding kids with relationships through these other sectors in student support programs and out of school time. So I don't think it has to be an either or. It can hopefully increasingly be a web of relationships in kids' lives. We also saw in this data set, not surprisingly to any of you, I'm sure, because we've known this for years, kids are much more likely at the elementary level to experience these relationships with teachers and program staff than they were at the secondary levels. And I remember when I was back working on those high school issues, we were talking about rigor and relevance and relationships. And I think especially at the high school level, we're still really needing to keep pushing on that emphasis on relationships. So relationships in themselves, we think, are an outcome. Social capital for young people is an outcome. But the question also is, what do relationships connect with? And so in this data set, we also examined how are relationships related to these critical social emotional competencies that many of us are trying to cultivate in young people and help young people cultivate in themselves. Through a partnership with the CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, we developed measures of their 5 competencies. And here's what we found when we compared kids' experience of relationships to their assessment of their own social emotional competencies. We found statistically significant associations with self-management and relationships, self-awareness and relationships, responsible decision-making and relationships, social awareness and relationships, and the relational competencies. I've got the relationship skills. Now, for many of you out there who are research-informed practitioners, your head may be screaming at this moment, correlation is not causation. Just because kids who have strong relationships report stronger social emotional competencies doesn't necessarily mean the relationships cause that. That's true. But we think there's strong reason in the science that Karen talked about at the beginning to think there is causation here at fact, that these relationships help kids develop SEL skills because in many ways those skills are as much caught as they are taught. Our work going forward will be exploring the degree to which there's a causal connection between SEL and relationships, but a starting point for that work is establishing the correlation, that there is a connection between the two. And here we saw that there was one. Final piece that we looked at in this kind of 3-legged stool of relationships and SEL was equity. And of course, the term equity, and I think it's a hopeful sign, is being used a lot these days. I think there's a challenge in defining what it means and defining practices that promote it. For the purposes of this conversation, and there's more in that report that I referenced at the outset, I picked out 3 aspects that we defined as actions that promote equity in a school or in a program. One is critical reflection. Do you help kids think about why injustice and inequity exists in the world? The second is what I somewhat clunkily here called teaching about equity. The key idea there is, do you teach kids what to do when they see inequity? And the third is, do kids feel that they are learning and experiencing just and safe spaces, free from bias, free from discrimination? Here's how that broke down. You can see in terms of just and safe space, we had most kids saying, yes, I get that in my schooling program, but a good number of kids saying somewhat or a little. Fewer kids felt their schooling program taught them about equity, what I can do when I see injustice, and about the same amount saying I engaged in critical reflection. And so we also looked at the association between equitable environments and SEL in this data set. And I'll just quickly break that down, the 3 equitable actions that I shared there and what we found. In terms of critical reflection, we found that kids who are in schools and programs that promote critical reflection about social justice, about what's fair in society, also were statistically significantly more likely to report strong social emotional skills. We found the same for the degree to which schools and programs teach kids about equity and how to act on that in their own lives. And then finally, we found the same in terms of kids feeling that my school or program is a safe space and people like me are treated fairly. So final slide here, you can see we really broke the bank at Search Institute on this one and used the PowerPoint clip, PowerPoint animations, smart art that all of you probably have. But I think it summarizes a potential finding of this research that can be maybe a jumping off point for our conversation. We found in this data set statistically significant associations between kids' experience of developmental relationships and social emotional competencies. That's important. It's grounds for both further research and I think further work among practitioners. We also found significant associations between kids' experience of equitable environments and social emotional competencies. But when we actually looked at the data to combine kids who experienced high levels of developmental relationships and equitable environments, they were even more likely to demonstrate strong social emotional competencies. There's what we would call an interaction effect between relationships and equity in the data. Now we have to dig in and see if that holds true for kids in all of the demographic subgroups. But we think it's a promising finding and one that may suggest that when we create interpersonal connections between adults and kids and then broader environments together as not an either or, but a both, that's a particularly emotional competency. So I'm going to both stop sharing my screen and apologize for the fact that my light above my computer has gone out. And so I may look a little like I'm in the dark here, but I'm very much with you. And let's dig into the conversation.
You're on mute, Karen.
I'm off mute now. Always takes a second to find the button. I should know where it is by now, but it always escapes me. Thank you for that. Apologize for the sort of the whirlwind push through the slides. They will all be available. Let me just say in advance, the Insights and Evidence report is extremely accessible, lots of pictures and graphs. And so don't be afraid to dig into it. It is not your normal dense research report, as Kent said. It's well worth flipping through the pages. I'm going to start with the last question that was posed, and then we'll sort of work backwards, because it's why we wanted to get this information out to you and put it in the context of sort of where we are in having this, even pre-pandemic, this increased understanding that context and relationships matter, and that we have a lot more that we can do than just say those words and go, oh, context and relationships matter. But there's a huge amount of science that's now being translated by folks like the Search Institute into what do we really mean by relationships? And then the one that we're pushing on is what do we really mean by context? And the word that Kent used of intentionality is one that we want to get to. That idea that what we saw was a decline in young people experiencing developmental relationships, as they went from elementary school to high school, that we see developmental relationships happening more frequently when young people are in youth organizations where there's more flexibility and more time. Those don't have to be that way. We can, if we're intentional about it, up the ante. We can make developmental relationships the starting point and make sure all of the spaces where young people spend their time are really sort of focused on that. If we can continue to do the research like Kent and others are doing to say, we're not doing this just for the sake of making sure young people feel that they're cared for and supported. We're doing this because it directly connects to their social and emotional development, which connects to their overall learning and their sense of agency. So we just have to keep pushing on this. So one of the questions was, how do we take this out? And that's the question that we really wanted to tee up. We're not going to answer it today, but we want to ask that question and answer it with you, because we think this is a different way for framing that those non-negotiables are deepening relationships. And one of the comments earlier was, we notice the unevenness. And when you look at the 5 components of developmental relationships, they're not even. And that relates to us to continuing to think what we do is lead with content. And our job is to get young people to grow intellectually or grow in skills, and not necessarily grow in those other ways, and certainly not share power if they're going to have a sense of agency. So we do have to really think about this more. Ken, I want to start a question back to you, which is one of the first questions that came out of, all right, obviously this research was done pre-pandemic. Why is it so important to get this front and center now?
I think it's a great question. And of course, just to state a very important point, how will the pandemic have changed what we learned in this data is an open question that we and others need to be thinking about. We are, I think, hopefully all of us, reading the news and watching on the verge, literally in weeks, of the distribution of a vaccine. And we know that that's going to be months and months and months before things are, quote unquote, back to normal, if ever. But I think it is time, and this is, of course, a series that, Karen, I think you've called Thought Leaders, which I think is, of course, I'm honored to even be included in that space. Part of the purpose of this is to sort of be saying, what's next? Like, what's over the next hill? And I think what's over the next hill is, at some point, whether it's in the spring or over the summer or next fall, is reentry into schools and programs. And I think that this data would suggest that when we embrace or face the challenge of reentry into schools and programs, leading with relationships, putting relationships first, is the first and biggest and maybe most obvious, but not unhelpful insight from these data. We have seen again and again and again that despite the fact that probably everyone on this call and most of us who get into this work with youth believe powerfully in the role of relationships, despite that fact, in schools and even in out-of-school time programs, other priorities take precedence when resources are tight, when pressures are huge. And so it's easy to see, and I think we've even seen in some of the evidence around distance learning in the pandemic in the present tense, but it's easy to see how once you are in a school, in a program, in a student support program, and you face the challenge of reintegrating kids who've lost a lot of time, who maybe have undergone trauma, who maybe have actually lost some of their personal investment in learning, that we would rush straight to content, or whether it's the content of your curriculum or content of your program. And so I think in answer to your question, the biggest insight from these data is relationships don't just happen, and we really need to have reentry prioritize the relationships first. That would be my biggest takeaway from this one.
Yeah, so 2 questions that are in the chat. One is just sort of the comment of, we have different settings, and we know settings really are sort of organized differently, and there are the adult-youth relationships are different in these different settings. And so do we need to redesign the settings? And if so, what does redesign look like? And I think a part of that, and I'll give it back to you, a part of us wanting to sort of emphasize even with the limitations of sample size, et cetera, emphasize the importance of having this data, of both being able to disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity, but also look at the comparison between what the students think are happening in their experiences and what the educators think are happening, is that we can use that as a roadmap to say, yes, if we want to be intentional about this and intentional about specifying what we mean by the characteristics of developmental relationships, we have a lot of room to basically get people to be more intentional, with young people understanding this is the goal as well. How quickly we can move all of the systems in all the settings to do this is a question, but I'll give back to you again, because I know this is some of the earlier work that Search did. One of the challenges that we face at the forum, certainly, and with the Readiness projects, is that when we talk school, we tend to think teachers and classrooms. There's a lot of room for the development of developmental relationships with other adults in the building, in other settings in the building. Is that something, and the fact that you really had those student support services mentioned and saw them sort of sitting in between the youth organizations, et cetera. When we're saying redesign, does this redesign does it start in the classroom, or is there something we can do with that finding that there can be adults in the building with slightly different roles who can be really the developers of relationships? What can we do with this immediately, and as we're thinking forward into the next 18 months, to get people to really not think of this focus on relationships as what we need to do now in the middle of a crisis and a pandemic, but what we really need to do to seed youth success?
Yeah, I think it's such a powerful point. The role that not just, of course, counselors and school psychologists can play in this, which have we've known that for a long time, though they have caseloads that are too big and things, but educational assistants, everyone, people who are in the school in an operations setting, people in the lunchroom, people who are there, and then bringing in community organizations. I think one of the things that embracing a relationships first agenda for your school or program can do for those folks who are adults in these buildings who are not teachers, and I say this as a former teacher, is this can be incredibly both legitimating and enabling to them. If you actually name building developmental relationships with young people as a primary priority of your school or program, and then you look around at what are your human resources to get that done, and you realize that exactly as you say, Karen, there are a lot of adults in schools who want to do that, who are passionate about that, but who need time and support to actually do that. And so I think broadening the circle of relationship builders and the definition of relationship builders in schools is who are staff in schools is huge. And the second piece, as you were saying, is building partnerships with student support organizations and out of school time that are explicitly relationship focused. Back in the days that I began this discussion talking about when I was working as administrator in an urban school district, we constantly talked about partnerships with out of school time and community organizations, but we very often struggled with what really was the through line across them. We were working on literacy during the school day, and we had a wonderful community organization that wanted to work on I remember one in particular, the Jane Addams School for Democracy. They wanted to do community empowerment, and they were very different. And we wanted to collaborate. We didn't have a through line across that. We're 30 years later, I would today be saying the through line is relationships, that we're actually, those are endeavors that are different in their focus, but they could have a common emphasis on expressing care, challenging growth, provide support, sharing power. So I think it really, as we think about reentry through relationships, it is the right time for leaders like those on this call to begin thinking ahead. I have to say, somebody who is here mentions a man who died here it's a mile from my home, Philando Castile, worked in the lunchroom at the elementary school that my sister went to, and I went to another school across town. We're in St. Paul, Minnesota because of busing at the time. But Philando is who was subsequently killed in a police incident. For anybody in that community, he was legendary for doing this in that school as the man in the lunchroom building developmental relationships with kids. And it was one reason why his death resonated so strongly across the community here in St. Paul. Sophia put that in the chat, and I just want to share that. The one other quick point that I would add, Karen, you mentioned the discrepancy between the youth and adult perspectives on relationships. And I just want to share with you and the folks here, two hypotheses for that have come up in our early questioning about it. And we haven't looked at this rigorously. One hypothesis for that is that kids and adults just define what is caring or what is challenging in some fundamentally different ways. So we actually, is what the kids think is caring fundamentally different than the staff. So that's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is not so much that kids define them differently, but that when a teacher or a youth program staff person fills out that survey, they're thinking of certain kids, but not all kids. And so when you say, do you care about kids? Do you challenge? Do you expand possibility? They respond at very high levels because they're thinking about some kids, but that if all kids don't experience those elements, when the youth fills out that survey, they're going to report it at much lower levels because they didn't get it. So it's an open question for us why we find that discrepancy, not just in this data set, but in many, many others. And those are two hypotheses. And I would say it's not necessarily an either or that might explain part of the difference that we see in that data.
Right. Absolutely. And there are a bunch of questions as you're scrolling about the data. And I know you're going to do more to disaggregate the data, even though your sample was 60% white, your sample is big enough that you can do some of those disaggregated analyses. I want to shift from, there was also a question of whether you did or you were able to ask about sexual orientation. Was that something that you actually collected data on?
I saw that as well. It's one of those times when you're on a live chat like this, I did not, because I'm the worst multitasker ever, start texting my colleagues at Search Institute. I'm assuming we did. We almost always do. And so I would be surprised if we didn't in this data set, but I don't know off the top of my head if we did. We have looked at other studies in which we have looked at both developmental relationships and developmental assets for LGBTQ youth. And so I don't know why we wouldn't do it. In this one insights and evidence brief, we obviously wanted to focus on just a few nuggets of data. And so it's not in that brief, but I will absolutely, as soon as we're done here, be emailing my colleagues on the research and practice team and asking if we did look at that. It's a critical focus going forward, and I would imagine that it's in this data set. I'll be disappointed if it's not, but we will look at that, and we can maybe put a blast out on our website to let people know that we'll continue to dig into that issue too.
And then one other question, just on the survey and the sample. In addition to the racial and ethnic demographics, what were the income demographics? Is this all kids? Is this predominantly low income communities? Is this free and reduced lunch? Did you have a target population that you were going after?
It's self-report data from the kid on income, and we have a measure that's been very effectively used, but it's the kid's self-report measure, what we call economic strain. So we have, in my family, we have enough to buy everything we want to, sometimes we struggle to buy basic necessities. And it is a very diverse data set in terms of that representation of self-reported economic strain, and with a bias toward kids in the low income categories. I don't have the breakdown percentage-wise, but going forward, we will be able to take a look at it. The one thing, and this is getting a little bit into the methodological weeds here, but I know it's an inherently research interested group that joins with something like this. We have looked at there is a strong association between kids' self-reported economic strain in their family and the free and reduced price lunch data in schools. We've looked at that in previous studies. One thing that's interesting though is that the kids' self-reported income of their families is always significantly higher than the free and reduced price reported level. And the hypothesis behind that is that either these parenting adults or others are helping those kids grow up in ways where they don't feel that they're deprived or that they're lacking resources. That said, it is when we're doing a study like this where we aren't getting a separate data set from the school or program from their, their family income data, it's a good proxy. And so that will certainly be used in the analysis going forward.
Okay, good. A couple of comments that have come in about sort of how relevant this is, not just by race and ethnicity, but for low income communities, communities of concentrated poverty. I want to, you in your questions about equity, one of the questions was opportunities for critical reflection. And I want to take a second to sort of land on that, because I won't put the slides back up, but in the science of learning and development, as we're understanding how learning happens, one of the things that's coming out to be absolutely most critical for both young people's development of those social emotional competencies, but also their sense of agency and their sense of identity, is meaning making. And meaning making is really this idea of not just I got the content, or I can reflect and say, yes, I feel it, but I actually get to reflect more abstractly and say, what does this mean to me? So your question about, are young people being given experiences where they can really think and reflect on racial injustice, on other things going on in their communities, and asking the question, not just how do I feel about it, but what does it mean for me? What can I do about it? Those kinds of questions are really critically important. And the brain research is showing, and there literally is the brain research is showing, that when you get that combination of things happening in the brain, acceleration happens on all fronts to get young people moving forward. So one of the things that I think, as people are saying, what do we do with this? The idea of not just of fully thinking about relationships and the way you're defining developmental relationships, but really, if we go back to that blue wheel, making sure that the content, making sure that the experiences we're giving young people have adequate time for reflection. We're not just pushing content at them, and they're big enough, they're challenging enough in terms of the ideas, and they're relevant enough for them that they really can dig in and make meaning out of them, which accelerates all the skill growth that we want. But it also comes back to deepen those relationships. At the point at which I've trusted you enough to have a really serious conversation about what's going on in my life or my community and why it's happening and where it's happening elsewhere, maybe the gap between the kid and the teacher in terms of experiences closes because we're having those. So I just want to emphasize there's a circle here that we're really trying to get people to think about. And to the question of how do we do this now, what we have right now is the gift that people are saying, take the time to do it. I mean, in school and youth work, take the time to do it, acknowledge that young people need it, and then find more people who are trying to help them. Whether we'll be that generous a year from now depends on how we use research like this, how we really set up a learning conversation. So I'm going to give you back one more question, which is the question of dosage. Does it matter? Or I'm assuming it does matter. How can we really demonstrate that not just when young people are in experiences and contexts in which these relationships are happening, in which SEL growth is happening, in which they're experiencing equity at a higher level, not just that when that's there, it's good, but that the more they're in those and the more consistent those are, how do we move from just getting information like this to turning this to a set of questions to say, ultimately, if we're going to talk about equity, we need to know dosage. We need to know in a young person's life, how much of this do they have? How many places can they go to get it? Do they have fallback mechanisms for making this happen? So can you put your research hat on and ask how we go from survey data to actually giving communities a way to ask, are kids getting what they need, and then asking them where they're getting it? Can we make that shift in real time?
So I love the question on dosage, and I will come right to it. I just want to say amen to your point that I hope didn't slide by people, because it would have slid by me 20 years ago, about the virtuous circle that can happen when we engage in that. You were talking about critical reflection with kids, and then I was like, oh God, I hope she's going to make this point, and you did. Doing that also builds the relationship. And that's this wonderful tradition that I've really learned since I've been at Search Institute, which is positive youth development. And it was very separate from the world that I started first 20 years of my career in, which was education. That when we invest in those competencies, the relationship itself is also deepened. And that's the magic of the ordinary magic piece here. So I want to make sure. There was a point where I was doing a presentation for a bunch of researchers of learning mindsets. And Carol Dweck was there, who many of you know is a very prominent researcher, creative growth mindset. And the one thing I said in my presentation, I said, these ingenious experiments that you've used to prove that how kids see their intelligence influences their motivation are also great relationship building experiences. When you work with a kid on growth mindset, it actually strengthens the relationship. Leaving aside the benefit that it has, the kid feels known, seen, connected. On the issue of dosage, this is one where I agree with you. It's critical, but we also have to be careful. I was just referencing the work that I've been privileged to learn about in positive youth development during my time at Search Institute. And in the previous work we did on developmental assets, which were factors internal and external that correlate with youth success, There was one study that seemed to show an inflection point at the number of adults in kids' lives, and the number was 3. And this predates me there, but some of my colleagues who were around for doing that research, they wince when they hear that, because once the number 3 adults got out of the gate, people would continually say, it's 3, it's 3. I need to know the number 3. And I understand that. People wanted something tangible, but in fact, the data was a slope, and 3 was just a pivot point. And kids did well with 2 and 1, and kids didn't do well with 4 and 5 and 6. And so we want to be cautious in thinking about the dosage question. And we get the dosage question in 2 ways in our current work on relationships. One, just like the assets example, is how many adults. And then the second is how often. And the somewhat frustrating answer I need to give you, though you invited a research answer, is this is cause for further study. We do have a new project that is underway right now, and it's called Cultivating Connections, and it is to map the experience of developmental relationships here in our home state of Minnesota, but across the whole state in out of school time and schools. And we're looking at precisely the question you're asking, Karen. How often are kids engaged in activities that are related to developmental relationships? And then to what extent do staff in these schools and programs have the systems and supports they need to build those relationships? Do they have professional development? Do they ever get data? Do their leaders emphasize relationships? Do they have a community of practice around relationships to share strategies? And so that Cultivating Connections study is ongoing right now. It's challenging to do in the pandemic, but we're making it happen. And we will have findings from that effort next summer. And it is explicitly focused on better understanding of the context within out of school time and schools for the experience of developmental relationships. And within that, we're thinking hard about this dosage question. We know it's really important. We don't want to have, though, a sort of a magic number that people seize in their minds that paradoxically sort of sets us back.
Yeah, I agree. And the word, we may need a different word than dosage. I brought that word into the conversation because I was just in a conversation with sort of school folks talking about accountability, and a conversation there is attendance. Well, if you're used to counting attendance as seat time, all right, you have to be someplace in order to start a relationship. And now we're not using seat time, and we want to come out into this broader world of after school, out of school, youth development, community programs, social justice programs. We're not going to measure seat time, but we want to know whether you're there. And then we want to know the quality. So there's just a conversation to be had about if we're really convinced that these opportunities happen everywhere, and that there are more places than schools, and certainly more places than classrooms, where there are adults with resources and skills who are intentionally trying to create these kind of environments for young people and create these kind of experiences. How do we capture that? How do we map it? How do we measure it? How do we do that? And I think in particular, as you started to do, how do we show that there are differentials, that the young person or a certain kind of young person who's not going to be not feeling connected in one setting feels connected in a different one. So there's just a whole nother way to have this conversation. But one of the things that we're anxious to do is to figure out how we take the next step of bringing this into community with practical tools. So you have a couple of questions about practical tools. Are the survey items that you used, are the things that you used available? Can people use these in their own communities and in their own programs?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We have, these measures were developed through a series of research studies, everything from studies of civic development funded by the National Science Foundation to studies of academic motivation funded by the Institute for Education Sciences. But as an applied research organization, we never want those measures just to sit on the shelf in a journal. So all of the measures in the report are available through what we're now calling the Developmental Relationship Survey. It actually really is surveys plural. It's a modular set of measures that schools and out-of-school time programs can use with not just kids, but also with staff. So, we're a nonprofit. We try and make these things as available as we can for as low a cost as we are able to. Through a recent investment from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're going to be able to make some subset of these measures available at very low cost or no cost. And this is very recent development, and we're pretty excited about it. And so in early 2021, we will be rolling out an opportunity for people to collect these data without paying us anything. And of course, we wish we could always do that, but thanks to the Gates Foundation, we're going to be able to do that for a period. And that, in the foundation's mind and ours, is part of exactly what, Karen, you've convened this discussion around. It's getting ready for reentry through relationships. How do we actually begin to become intentional and collect those data? But even beyond that support from the foundation, those measures will continue to be available from our organization. And if you go to searchinstitute.org, you can get all the information on that that's there as well. The one thing I'll just say too is, if for whatever reason, because your school or program you don't have the bandwidth to collect data, or you don't have the money to collect data, you can and should still collect your own data on relationships. And a famous way that folks have done it, and the Making Caring Common project at Harvard has done a nice job synthesizing this, is you basically get the names of all the kids you serve, and you get staff together, and you actually, and you could do this virtually, or you could do this once we're all back together, you have them put a dot by somebody that they know well, and you can flip that. You also could have the young people do that. And it is a potentially very powerful way to look at the kids you serve and see who doesn't have a dot by their name. The one big caveat, and this is kind of a no-brainer, but I think all of us understand how this can happen because people are so busy, is once you do that, you actually then have to do something to connect with the kids. So don't do what we call the dot exercise and then not act on it, or don't give the survey and then not act on it. But don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. Like, just jump in to try and understand how kids are experiencing those relationships in your setting.
Right. I mean, I'm glad you gave that example, because that's one of my favorites that you all did, the dot exercise. I think I was even in a room when it happened, and it has an immediate and a powerful impact on both the adults and the young people. Again, if you're doing this and intentionally getting all the adults in the building to put their dots up, you realize there's more adults in the building. You know, if we're just like dividing dots, I mean, dividing names on the wall by people, by adults, the ratio gets a whole lot better if we count all the adults too. A lot of those adults that you don't think about put dots up. Yep. Right? I know this kid because they come in the cafeteria every day and they talk to me. I know them because I drive the bus. And then again, when we come back to this idea of how we're really supporting those relationships and using them as the beginning of sort of pushing through, it's really important. So this is a conversation that we could do for a long time, and we're going to keep doing it. So those of you who are on the call, and I've noticed at the end that most of the questions have just been coming to the panelists, which is fine. But as we put the video back out, we will put the questions and the comments back out to you, and we'll try to answer some of them if we go through and we didn't answer them, and we can. One thing that I do want to acknowledge, Kent, you mentioned positive youth development. Obviously, people who know me, sometimes people call me the grandmother of youth development, or at this point, the great grandmother of youth development. But we are also at a moment in time, because of the deepening understanding of context and experience. And I think the deepening understanding, although it was always there in the British version of youth development, of our goal is not just to build competencies, but to help young people find their journey to identity and agency and power. Mm-hmm. that we have to have better language. And so someone asks about, should we call it positive youth development, or should we really be talking about social justice youth development? And they've dropped some things in the quote in the chat. We'll give you all of those tools. We've got in SEL, and you use the famous Castle wheel SEL. Castle is really in the process of talking now about transformative SEL. Mm-hmm. Not that you don't stay with those 5 broad competency areas, but that you push them through. So this isn't just building competencies so that you can do better in school. It's building competencies so that you can do an analysis of why your school isn't working for you, of why your community sort of suffers with chronic rates of crime and poverty. It's building those skills. So there is definitely a movement there. Lots of different ways to talk about it, but really important that we put all of this together. And again, just back to this, relationships are the door in, but they aren't the only thing. So thank you for sort of pushing us to define relationships, developmental relationships beyond caring. And then I will continue to thank my colleagues at the SOLD Alliance and Turnaround for Children in particular, to just give us these non-negotiables of, if we're really trying to optimize youth thriving, there are a set of non-negotiables. And for better, for worse, we have environments that have emphasized some, but not all. And in some ways, even giving young people, I mean, this is the thing I'd love to do, giving young people a very simple tool to go in to the environments where they spend time, name it, say who's there, and then ask, in terms of those characteristics, are you getting these things? To somehow connect the quality of the experience they have with their assessment of the quality of the environment in some way is a next step for us to be able to just activate the openness that we have right now of acknowledging that learning happens everywhere and sometimes it doesn't happen anywhere. And there's something we can do about it that's more intentional. So Kent, I'm going to give you the very last word, and I'm going to hand it back to Ian. And I will, and before I hand it back to Ian, I'll make a plug, and Ian, you can be ready to drop this in the chat for a conversation we're going to have next Tuesday that we're opening up to a broader group, the last in our sort of Make the Invisible Visible discussion series. But Kent, final word.
I'm just going to echo what you just said about intentionality. When you begin to take developmental relationships seriously, and especially if you collect some kind of objective data from the young people you serve, it can be difficult. It can raise difficult issues of resources and race and equity and things. But here's the really hopeful point. This is something you and we can do something about. This is eminently within our power. Like, we do not need to have all of the resource flows in society change to build more developmental relationships within schools and programs and community organizations with kids. And so it can be challenging, but it's doable, it's actionable. And so I think that's a hopeful way to think about the big challenges that we have, but they are ones that we are up to.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. And Ian has dropped a link into the chat. Next week, as we head into the holidays, we'll have a conversation with an incredible lineup of folks who are sort of education leaders from Turnaround for Children and the Education Council. We'll have Hal Smith from the National Urban League. We'll have Ross Weiner from the Aspen Institute, Hetty Chang from Attendance Works, talking to us about they're experts in education accountability. And they're all watching with interest or trepidation, depending on the day, of whether or not in this time of disruption, we actually can move forward and get rid of some of the things that have been barriers, or we end up coming back, we have a vaccine, we go back. Hopefully we don't go back. But one of the questions that we're going to ask them is, can we in this moment think about community accountability in a different way? So this is not just school accountability, and are we going to use seat time, and is it going to be standardized tests, but can we broaden this? So this conversation has been really useful in that space, just to get people warmed up and thinking. And you guys in the chat have been a great and engaged audience, and I thank you. Ian, last words?
Thank you very much to both Kent and Karen, and hope that everyone will be able to join us next Tuesday, and have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you very much for spending an hour with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.